This is our conversation about Native American shell heaps. And I'm Alice Kelley. I'm from the University of Maine, associated with the School of Earth and Climate Sciences, the Climate Change Institute, and the Department of Anthropology. Dr. Bonnie Newsome, my colleague, is also in the Climate Change Institute and an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UMaine. And so what we'd like to talk with you about today is our Maine shell heaps or shell middens, and also our Midden Minders project, a citizen science project. And so right now I am talking from Bonnie's presentation, and we'd like to note that there is at least a 12,000-year-old Indigenous history in Maine. And a great part of that is recorded in the oral history of the Wabanaki people. On the left, you see a drawing of Glooskap, the hero figure in stories that are used to explain a great deal of the landscape and the interrelationship of humans and the landscape to the Wabanaki people. There's also often a comment that the Indigenous people left no written record, but we do have the evidence of petroglyphs in several places in Maine. We see one here from Passamaquoddy, or from Machias Bay, from the Passamaquoddy people, and we see them in a variety of other places as well. While my conversation is going to be focused on shell heaps, I would note that these petroglyph locations are also threatened by rising sea level, because as sea level is rising, it is covering some of the carvings. And so we can access some of these only at the lowest of low tides. We know that they span some time in history. They haven't been dated, obviously. We don't have an idea of exactly when they started, but we do know that they carried right up to the time of European contact, because one of these petroglyphs shows a boat with sails, very much like a 1600 sailing vessel. And then, of course, there's the archaeological record, what we see here on the right. This is not exactly on the coast, but it's very indicative of the type of exposures that we get in many places. There's a rich interior archaeological record, such as this one. The issue here is that because of Maine's acidic soils, all that we preserve that is organic has to be calcined. So we see lithics, we see ceramics, and calcined bone, and of course charcoal, but nothing more than that. So shell heaps, mounds, middens, depending on how you want to call these, are the evidence of Indigenous occupation on the coast prior to European contact. And some were quite large. On the left is the Glidden, or the whaleback midden. It was probably the largest midden in Maine, probably quite large. And I'll talk a bit about its demise in a few minutes. On the right is a nearby shell mound. This is an oyster shell mound. That's much more typical of what we see today. So this we had just as a nod to the folks. I know many of you are from the Southeast, and so this is what you're seeing and what we're reading a great deal about to understand what we are seeing in our shell rings or shell mounds. We don't have rings, ours tend to be mounds, but rather than seeing these complete features, what we're seeing is a much smaller fraction of what we think was much larger. The large midden I just showed you, the whaleback, and its partner, the Glidden midden, are both on a tidal river, and so they haven't experienced as much erosion, and so we have a sense that these middens may have been much larger. What we see on the open coast are features that have been experiencing thousands of years of erosion, and the suggestion from the archaeology and the morphology is that in most cases, we're only looking at the last remnant, the last bit that was the most landward side of the shell mound, excuse me. So these are the kinds of things that you would see in a Maine shell mound. There are some that are composed of oysters. These tend to be focused in the Damascotta area in the mid-coast. There are a few scattered others, but most of the shell heaps or shell mounds in Maine are composed of primarily clam shells with some mussel shells and other mollusks as well. They can range in thickness from 1 meter to more. The Glidden midden is over between 3 and 4 meters high, but most of them are about 1 meter. And of course, as you get more landward, they thin. And so we're thinking many of them are thinner, and we're thinking we're seeing smaller accumulations or simply smaller middens. So we know of about 2,000 shell heaps on the Maine coast. They are present in a variety of sizes and settings. On the top left is the Glidden midden. This is the largest extant midden in Maine and said to be the largest north of Georgia. And so this is quite large. It's an oyster shell midden, and it extends for almost over 100 meters along the Damascotta River shoreline. It is present largely because the landowner at the time in the late 1800s did not want it to be mined, or it would have disappeared as well. So we have it as a result of landowner intervention. One, thank them. Very typical of the other portions of the mid-coast Maine are on the bottom left. These are middens located on high bluffs. These are bluffs of approximately 2 to 3 meters high with a 1 meter or less layer of shell on the top. If we look to the top right, with Washington County, Maine, here's a very small midden. This is on up in a tidal cove, and this may have been quite small to start. We think that some of these were quite large and others may be quite small, primarily just a family group. And then on the lower right, we see another midden here. It's on a very low upland eroding out onto a beach. And so we have this variety of settings. We've started to look at, well, over the last 20 years, people have been investigating seasonality. It appears that some of these smaller shell heaps are tucked up into protected coves, and the faunal evidence suggests that they were winter occupations. The larger ones seem to fit more with a spring and summer occupation. So one of the most important things about our shell heaps is the preservation in these features. We don't, as I said before, we don't see organic material in the interior sites, but here, because of the breakdown of the shell, it's a buffering action. And so we can have plant remains, particularly in the form of seeds and not necessarily having to be burned, and a rich faunal record. We also have material culture preserved in these. And so as in the interior sites, stone tools, ceramics, but then we have the bone technology as well. So not just faunal remains telling us something of seasonality or what people were using as resources, but also to make tools, decorations as these shell beads, and even musical instruments as the bird bone flute that was recovered from a shell heap. And then in addition, there are cultural features. We see hearths, house floors, and then features such as the one on the left, which is open to interpretation. It's a standing stone. Is it a boundary marker? Is it some sort of have a ritual significance, a family significance? We don't know. We know that we've seen similar sorts of features at other shell heaps. And so this is still part of the research on how these indigenous families were living on the coast. To the right, you would recognize something, a feature like this. We have evidence of burning. We get some greasy charcoal-rich layers in these shell heaps. And so this could be interpreted as a hearth or another type of feature. And I'm going to say, I'm not the archaeologist in the pair, so I'm apologizing ahead of time to Bonnie if I make a stumble on some of these. The other important part of this is the preservation of faunal remains, as I said, not just for what people were eating, but we're seeing species presence and absence. This information is particularly useful for fisheries. Fisheries studies tend to look at 1950 as the pre-industrial fishing, but we know, of course, that fishing started as early as the 1500s with Europeans coming for the cod fisheries. And so these accumulations of faunal remains, of fish remains, give us a really good sense of size of fish, what fish were present, and with that presence comes season changes in ocean currents. We also see things like swordfish rostrum or swordfish hunting. You can see the bottom left. Swordfish occur in a number of the late archaic sites and disappear rather abruptly at about 3,800 years ago. And that's an area of research by Dr. Newsom. We also have the opportunity to investigate extinct species. The great auk remains are found in shell heaps, as are sea mink, and Dr. Newsom is cooperating with folks from the University of Oklahoma, as well as Middlebury College, to look at sea mink DNA on sea mink remains that were recovered from shell heaps. So these shell heaps tell us a great deal about the past, but they are also the link to the past for the Wabanaki people. And there are 4 recognized tribes within Maine: the Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, the Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot. And with the exception of the Passamaquoddy, have been largely removed from the contact with their heritage spaces in the coast. And so these features are important to us archaeologically, but they're also very important culturally, as well as being part of Maine's history as well. So through material culture, we can get some feeling for lifeways in Maine. We use them for the pre-European contact, but we recognize in these shell heaps that there are also European materials as well. The Saint Ange pot on the left is a French pot that was recovered from a shell heap in down East Maine, and you can see it dates to the early to mid-late 1600s. Some peach pits or plum pits were also recovered from the site. Plums don't grow in Maine, so the idea is that they must have come preserved, probably from Europe. And also in the 1700s, a chamber pot found its way into the shell midden, or at least a 1700s chamber pot. So we see a European influence, and the interpretation of, was this reoccupation of a native site? Was it interaction between native and European cultures? We don't know. And then finally, the middle image is from a China doll that was recovered from a more modern or more recent shell midden. In the 1800s, there was a mixed race occupation on Malaga Island off the coast of Maine, and there they created a shell heap as well as part of their fishing practices. So shell heap archaeology in Maine ranges from pre-contact right through to the almost modern times. And if you go to a cannery, There's a modern heap right there behind the cannery. But what we're looking at with these shell middens is that we're seeing a preservation of a group of people who were frequently marginalized, and in fact, to this day, still are. If we look at the historic sites in Maine, the things that attract historic preservation funding, what we see are forts, lighthouses, churches or meeting houses, and grand mansions. And out of all the historic sites that we have listed in Maine, we have one shell heap, one Indigenous site, and that is the Whaleback Shell Midden site, where in fact what you're looking at is the remains of a mined shell midden. So at this point, I'm going to switch very quickly to my slide deck, if you'll give me a minute. And I was not expecting to be doing this, so here we go. View slideshow, and here we are. So we have these features, these are archaeological features with their tie to the past, and that represent the history of a marginalized group of people. And just as we are beginning to really get a handle on the importance of these sites, what they mean to Maine history, to Maine's Indigenous people, we're seeing a greater amount of erosion and damage to these sites. And so the type of damage that is coming is through wave erosion. This is the one that we're all most familiar with. But in Maine, we also have an issue with bank slumping. This can be tied to waves, and that waves can undercut a bank, but often it is simply the saturation of the glacial marine sediment that blankets most of the coast of Maine. As water is moving through that sediment, it can move, it slumps in large arcuate blocks that can remove several meters of material at a time. And because our shell heaps are situated on top of many of these middens, or on top of the bluffs, we lose this material rather catastrophically and goes right down into the surf zone. So wave erosion and bank slumping related to natural processes. And then we have the issue of development and looting. This is a looter's pit. They would call themselves collectors. Nice square sides, I think, trying to feel very scientific about what they were doing, but thoroughly churning up and destroying the site. And of course, as you all know, once those artifacts leave and go to somebody's mantle or windowsill, the history is gone. We have lost an important part of our cultural heritage. As in many places in Maine, shell heaps or shell middens are not protected. If they're on federal land or state land, disturbance of all federal or state land is prohibited. But on private land, a landowner can do what they wish. And looters, particularly on our offshore islands, and this picture is from an island, show up when the island isn't occupied, and the only recourse the landowner has is to try and address the issue through trespassing laws. We also see artifacts going for sale. It's easy to say you've inherited a grandparent's collection when you're actually going out and destroying these sites. So this is really an ongoing problem for us. So mining and development pressure. The whaleback midden, the one I mentioned earlier, 10 meters thick, 75 to 100 meters wide, along the Damascotta River for approximately 100 meters, more depending on if you look at the satellite shell heaps that are associated with it, and almost entirely mined in the late 1880s for chicken feed and road surfacing. And so it's completely gone. It's now the site of a historic site, but the only place you can see the midden was what was preserved under the processing building. Fortunately, we don't see large-scale mining, but we do see development. And this is not a picture to show you the building on the barrier island, but in fact, the roofs of the condominium that was built on a midden. My husband, who is a coastal geologist, saw that midden being carted away in dump trucks to build the condos. Private property, nothing could be done. And the sad part of this is that as its location may have been one of the older shell middens in the state, as it was sitting on the back of a back barrier lagoon. So as we lose shell heaps, we lose Indigenous culture, Maine history, the evidence of past lifeways, what Indigenous families were doing on the coast, how they were moving about the coast. We also lose paleo-environmental information, and we lose that sense of place. Although they don't figure large in many people's view of where they are, if you talk to local folks, they know where they are. They'll mention them, and when they're gone, we're going to miss them. So what is happening? I don't need to tell you folks about sea level rise. This is the example of what's happening in Maine. If we look at the trend lines on these two graphs, the one to the left in southern Maine and Portland, Maine, the one to the right in Bar Harbor, we can see that we see similar events. And if we look at a trend for sea level rise since 1993, you can see a abrupt increase in the rate of sea level rise. When I started teaching at the University of Maine, and I'm dating myself, in the mid-1980s, I was telling students that sea level rise was 1 to 2 millimeters, probably 2 millimeters. It is now 3. So within my teaching career, I have seen this change. Again, looking at projections, in 2015, Maine had sponsored a assessment of Maine's climate, and this was the graph that was produced for the Portland using the existing tidal record and then adding on the IPCC projections of what we might see. And of course, you can see an error, the error bar there, or the range. But if you've undoubtedly heard about the NOAA report that just came out, we're now looking at 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise, perhaps up to 2 feet in the East and Gulf coasts. And these areas are expected to see the fastest sea level rise due to land subsidence and compacting sediment in your part of the world, in the southeastern part. And so that projection now is really very much an under projection. So what does that mean for our Maine shell heaps? Well, it certainly rises the level of the impact of daily waves and ice erosion as this hits against the coast. And here I'm looking out the window, I'm seeing snow falling. There is ice on the bays and the edges of the estuaries. And as spring comes, that ice is loose and it begins to move up and down with the tides and acts very much like sandpaper, rubbing up and down and eroding the bluff and any exposed midden. And of course, with that rise in sea level comes a rise in the reach of storms. And of course, with climate change, we're seeing increased storms and increased storm intensity. And some of our research right now and working with our volunteers is gathering evidence about those storm impacts on the coast. And we're starting to see a bit more complicated pattern than what we originally had thought. So bringing the reach of the water higher against the coast and against middens. And of course, with a storm surge, that increases the height even more. with a high tide, a spring tide, that brings it even higher. And so we're seeing erosion of the coast at a higher level than has been experienced in the past. Also, with climate change comes warming. And when we look at what has happened in Maine, we see a warming of our coast, of our temperatures. But with that warming, we're seeing increased freeze-thaw events. And of course, you know that when water is running, it's in one state. As it freezes, it expands. And so when we see the kinds of freeze-thaw that we're experiencing now, we're getting this in repeated freezing and thawing, contraction, expansion, which is loosening the shell material and setting it up for erosion so that the activity of that erosion will, or those waves will be even greater. We just, in the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 days, a week apart, of 60-degree weather, rapidly followed by 10-degree weather. And so we're seeing this pulsing in the material, and it's increasing slumping, it's loosening that material, and so it's resulting in archaeological damage. So what to do? We have over 2,000 middens, 3,500 miles of coast, and a very few professional archaeologists. And so putting some thought together, we came to the conclusion of we needed help, and that's in the form of our citizen or community science program of the Maine Midden Minders Network. That network came about first in 2017 as the result of a Sea Grant funded program that had a science component and a policy component and a science component. The science component was using ground penetrating radar to delineate shell middens. The policy component was looking at what we could do about this erosion. So we sponsored a facilitated stakeholders meeting, brought together everyone we could think of that might have an interest in shell midden erosion, so state conservation groups, historical societies, people from universities, tribal representatives, as well as avocational archaeologists. We had a 2-day meeting. We went in the field and looked at middens, then met at the UMaine's Marine Center and heard talks from researchers, as well as folks who were working very successfully in the area of coastal cultural heritage in Ireland and Scotland. So out of that meeting came the idea that we obviously needed to do something, and that would be through a citizen science project with the tasks of monitoring and documenting change at shell middens, preserving cultural and environmental information, and bringing in the community. We've in the past had a very sharply delineated line between avocational archaeologists and professional archaeologists. Our current state archaeologist has done a great deal through the Maine Archaeological Society to work with the non-professionals and to foster something beyond just collecting to put things in a shoebox. And so we want to use that community engagement as part of an education outreach or program. So the goals of our network is to provide data for understanding erosion processes and rates. Until this point, there have been perhaps 1 or 2 places where erosion has been measured and we can really look at erosion rates. We'd like to get something other than anecdotal evidence, and this is how we hope to do it. We'd like to use that information for a variety of research programs, but one that we've really focused on is trying to provide information for prioritization of cultural resources. You know that resources are tight. And so this is a way for us to try and focus what we have into helping to preserve locations and also to preserve the information. We know that we can't hold these places forever. Some will probably have to go. So we want to have as much information for the future that we can. And again, the outreach with the idea of creating appreciation of Maine's Indigenous cultures, because this is a part of our Maine community that has really been forgotten. So how to go about building our Midden Minders network? Well, first you need to identify partners. The tribes and the Maine Historic Preservation Commission have been great partners. Without the cooperation of the state archaeologist, we would have gone nowhere. Art Spies has been an incredible help. The tribes have been very supportive of our efforts as well. And then we've reached out to conservation organizations. While we do work with individuals, it is much easier if there is a organization in place that can help with our training and our outreach. And so we developed a monitoring plan that included site description, measurements, and photography, and I'll talk about each of those in a little more detail. With that, we also need a database. If you're going to produce all this data, you need to keep it somewhere, you need to have it in an organized way, and we're working very hard on this portion. One of the things that we need to be cognizant of is property owners, because most of the shell heaps in Maine are on private property. And so we require our volunteers to demonstrate that they have the property owner's permission before they go there. We also protect the information by not having our database open to all comers. This is very different from a phenology style database where you can go in and see what's going on in various parts of the state. Here, minders can only access materials for sites that they are working on. And this is to protect the sites, landowner privacy, and to make sure that we're not producing a looter's guide to Maine archaeological sites. The local folks know where they are, but we have a problem with summer visitors wanting to come and collect as well. And then to restrict access by permission to the whole database, and that would be open for tribal needs, verified research, or for cultural resource management, typically with state or federal partners. And then we'd also like to acknowledge Maine Sea Grants support for creating a website, and you can go to Maine Midden Minders and visit our site. So what's some of the data that we're putting in? Well, we're looking at making erosion measurements. Very simple, creating a baseline. Here in the cartoon, I used 2 trees. In the image to the right, you see a school group from the Cobscook Institute doing measurements. And here we used rebar as our baseline endpoints so that we could recover those locations using a metal detector. The rebar is sunk in low enough so that it doesn't inhibit any mowing on the field. And so we can go back to these places and make measurements on an annual basis and be able to see what change has occurred at these sites. Now, we've just really started with measurements. We were getting underway, and then COVID happened, and the university said you can't work with anybody or go anywhere. And so we sat for 2 years, and we're just getting back into the field. But this was the Cobscook Bays group second measurement. And so we have seen some erosion at this site, and the students were really great to work with and really excited about what they were doing. We have some sites which are quite large or are in really hard to access locations. And so the Maine Historic Preservation Commission funded us for a pilot project of using drones. And so one of my colleagues, Kristen Schild at the University of Maine, is a remote sensing expert. And so we came out and established a survey that we knew our survey's location. We had points surveyed in using a kinematic GPS station, and then we flew the drone. We could tie those images to the survey and produce a 3D image of the shell midden site to less than a centimeter accuracy. The idea is that we've recollected material, the same information at several sites, and we're now going through the process of comparing those to see if we can document change. In 1 year, in some places, we may not see change. And this is part of our understanding of the processes that are taking place. We're seeing more and more that erosion at these sites is often very episodic. And so we'll see very small incremental change, and then suddenly a storm, or more often a pair of storms that hits just at the right orientation for that site, just at the right stage of tide with a big storm surge, and then we can see catastrophic loss. So this is an idea of trying to document these processes and get that out to the community. We also use photography, images to record midden conditions and document change through time, and also to record eroding artifacts. This is a tough one for volunteers. Some people would prefer to slide that into their pocket. Other people want to see that it goes to the right place. And so we're trying to work with that. And of course, it is actually the property of the property owner. So we're hoping to build a library of artifacts eroded from each point. I'm very happy to say that the chipstone point that you see there was brought to us by a 12-year-old girl who found it when she was 9. She had very carefully labeled where it came from. She could take us to the spot, and so we've included that artifact in our database. So we have a lot of partners, National Park, the Wabanaki tribes, conservation groups, historical society, and we're always looking for more to cooperate with us. So here in Midden Minders, we have coastal citizen scientists preserving irreplaceable information, and through working in a variety of ways, in a variety of locations. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and to acknowledge the support of Maine Historic Preservation Commission, Maine Sea Grant, the Senator George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, the Climate Change Institute, and the University of Maine. So thank you.